Now in the Zelda games, you always get to see a couple of things. Dungeons, puzzles, and of course bosses that you have to take on in a one-on-one fight. And usually people love them, and look forward to them as soon as they enter the dungeon they are found in. Well, that's what I usually have. But we have seen so many of them by now, that most of us usually forget about a lot of them. Even though a lot of these forgotten bosses are amazing and among the best in the entire franchise. So today we will take a trip down memory lane to take a look at bosses that most of us have forgotten about, even though they are pretty neat or even beyond amazing. So let's dive right in and look at some of my favorites out there that no one ever talks about. Number 5. Now in the Zelda franchise, there are a number of bosses that everyone knows about. For example, Ganondorf. Now another one that fits in this category is Dark Link, who became quite famous thanks to the success of Ocarina of Time. However, we had actually seen that boss before, but he looked very different, and the fight with him was quite, odd. Well, compared to modern Zelda games at least, and that's because the entire fight was in a side-scrolling 2D world. His name was Link's Shadow, and he was seen in the second Zelda game ever, which isn't that popular because it's so different compared to all the other titles. He's the final boss and appears after you defeat Thunderbird in the Great Palace. And the interesting thing about the fight is that it serves as the final test before you can obtain the Triforce of Courage and wake up Princess Zelda. Now, this game is ridiculously difficult. Most people can't beat this game, and I've never even attempted it. Also, because it doesn't look like my kind of thing. And this is the most difficult opponent you take on during the second quest to save Hyrule. And because of that, I respect it. And the idea behind it is also pretty cool. Now, the strategy for defeating him is to attack him where his guard is down. In a lot of ways, it's a cool one-on-one sword fight. Although it is a bit primitive because the technology wasn't that developed yet. But still, it tried to do something new and also quite interesting. But just like the fight in Ocarina of Time, you can cheat a bit. Because you can also duck in the very left corner of the arena and repeatedly stab him when he gets close. And then, after this appearance, he was seen more and more, returning in other Zelda games and even spin-off titles like Super Smash Bros. And this is where it all started, but a lot of people forget about that completely. Even though the idea behind this first version was already really cool and pretty well done, I think. At least for the standards of those times. Sure, it's not perfect, but it is what it is. And it should be remembered. Number 4. Now, the most popular Zelda game out there is Breath of the Wild. It has sold the most copies after all. But before the game rose up from the depths of Nintendo Incorporated, we had Twilight Princess. In a lot of ways, this game was the poster child of the franchise together with Ocarina of Time, having the most sales out of all, and rightfully so. I'm currently replaying it on stream here on YouTube, which is every Friday at 7 PM Central European Time, and it holds up well. But there's one boss fight in this game that no one ever mentions, the Deku Toad, which is seen in the Lakebed Temple. Now, this huge toad is apparently a 1,000-year-old Toadpolis, so keep that in mind. You're killing some sort of rare ancient creature. Now in this fight, he drops down from the ceiling to the floor and shakes off several Toto eggs from its back, which will hatch and attack you. Now his attack pattern is to jump to the ceiling, and he then tries to fall on top of you. And after this, he shakes off more eggs, which will hatch and attack you. Now if you roll out of the way in time to avoid being crushed, the Deku Toad gets stunned, allowing you to strike its exposed tongue. And you can even use bombs in this fight, because you can throw it in his mouth or shoot at him with bomb arrows. Overall, I also think this is a great boss fight, just like all the others in the game. There ain't nothing but bangers in Twilight Princess, okay? But nobody talks about this boss. It really feels like it has disappeared from people's memory, even though it's quite fun. I think this fight is a lot better than the King Dodongo fight seen in Ocarina of Time, but still, that one is significantly more famous. However, I won't forget about it. Sure, I basically hate every water temple, but they still do some things right. Number 3. Now another straight up banger of a Zelda game is the Wind Waker. It's incredibly iconic in my opinion because it's a sea adventure. And as you can imagine, this means that there are a lot of cool monsters to fight. However, for some reason, people always forget about the best one. Sure, all the fights in the dungeons were fun, but there's one out there in the open world that's even better. In some ways, the Big Octo, which is a large squid-like creature that inhabits the waters of the Great Sea and will appear if you're nearby. Now there are a total of 6 Big Octos that can be found in the game, and to defeat it, you must shoot and destroy all of its eyes with a projectile, either with the hero's bow, the boomerang, or with bombs. Now when the squid rises from the water, a whirlpool slowly pulls you into its mouth, and you need to beat it before you reach the center. In a lot of ways, it's a race. You must shoot all of his eyes before he actually swallows you whole. It really feels like some sort of sea battle with an ancient monster from the depths, which is perfect for a game like the Wind Waker. It makes the sea so much more fun and interesting in my opinion. There are sea devils to hunt down, and they are legendary among the fishermen of the Great Sea world. But barely anyone talks about them or even remembers them. Like I said, they have a cool theme and story, but I see no one making videos on them. I can remember when I made a video on them, video in the upper right corner by the way. It was one of the only ones on YouTube, but I still think they deserve a lot more love. So here I am, giving them some much needed attention. Number 2. Now, throughout the years, we've seen a lot of 2D titles. It's where the franchise started, and Nintendo never abandoned it. And we've seen quite a lot of amazing bosses in these titles, but some are forgotten about by the masses, even though they were amazing. And there's one that I wanted to add to this list, because I like it so much, and people barely talk about him. The Stellblind, a boss from A Link Between Worlds, who is seen in Thief's Hideout, located in Lorule. When you encounter him, he materializes in the center of the room, carrying a large sword and shield. He will defend against all your attacks while slowly chasing you. And so you need to do something else to beat him. You must force Stellblind to raise his shield, and then wall merge onto its surface. This will confuse the monster, and then he lowers his guard. At that point you can pop out of the shield and strike him right in the back with your sword. Then he recovers and spews dark magic at you, creating separation between the two of you. Now you do this a couple of times, and at some point he changes tactics. He will toss his shield aside, and thanks to this his movement speed will increase. He will make vertical sword slashes that get momentarily stuck in the floor if he misses, and will occasionally perform a version of the Great Spin attack, chasing you down while he spins. And then when the battle enters its third stage, his head will detach from his body and will begin to spew dark magic continuously while it flies around the room, and his body will attack you. So clearly this fight is a lot complexer than most people would think, and it has a lot going for itself. You get to mess around with the wall merging in an amazing way, end up with a cool one-on-one sword fight, and get a grand challenge at the end. Because believe me, this fight is quite difficult. Dealing with both the head and body is a lot to handle. During this fight you are forced to solve problems to counter it and have to improvise in order to win. But even though this is a really cool fight, barely anyone talks about it, which makes me a bit sad. This is probably the best one-on-one sword fight in any 2D Zelda game, but it doesn't really get the love it deserves. But I love it, and this is probably my favorite 2D game in the entire franchise, together with the Minish Cap. Number 1. Now we get to the real gem, the best 2D boss fight that we have ever seen in the Zelda franchise, but barely anyone talks about it. Now, like I said a second ago, the Minish Cap is my favorite 2D Zelda title, together with A Link Between Worlds. And in this game you take on Vati, a villain that's quite different compared to Ganon both in character and boss fight. And I gotta say, the battle with him is a real beauty. First he turns into a mighty sorcerer who uses lasers, fireballs, teleportation and more. This part of the fight is already very hectic, fun and challenging. And oh boy, this fight isn't easy. And I gotta say, this form already looks beautiful. In my opinion, it's really fitting for a version of Vati that's powered up by the Light Force. Now after this he transforms into something new, creating a very different challenge. He turns into a gigantic eye with smaller ones around him. and you need to use the special power of the Force Sword to hit all the open eyes at the same time, which is quite hard because he constantly moves around and creates crystals that block your path. And of course, during this he attacks by shooting energy balls and making boulders drop down from the ceiling. This part challenges you in a very unique way. It forces you to be aware of your surroundings, because otherwise you can't use the special power of the Force Sword. And this is a lot harder than you think, especially because he constantly moves around and also attacks. And in his final form, he goes completely nuts, combining all kinds of different items, concepts, and attacks to make your life hell. I could talk for hours about this fight, because it really gives you everything the game has to offer. But if you want to know more, then it would be better if you checked out my other top 5 video on the best bosses of the entire franchise. It's in the upper right corner. I don't want to repeat myself too much after all. But regardless of how amazing this fight is, no one ever talks about it. Just search for Vati on YouTube and you will see what I mean. But I love it, and will do so forever. Thanks for watching, everybody. Be sure to leave a like, because it really helps me with the algorithm, like a lot. It's one of the most important things ever. Subscribe, check out the videos in the upper right corner, because I put 2 lovely ones up there, and I will see all of you in the next one.